When James T. Laney stepped down as Emory University's president, he was leaving an institution of higher learning better off than when he found it. Dr. Laney's leadership helped propel Emory from a regional teaching institution to a major national research university, all within a brief span of 16 years. His energy and vision succeeded in attracting more students, faculty, academic departments, and funding to the university he came to love. He convinced President Jimmy Carter to join Emory's faculty, and his friendship with Coca-Cola's president Robert Woodruff was instrumental in the donation of $105 million to the university, the largest single gift ever to any institution at that time. On balance, Dr. Laney's philosophy and practice of what he termed education of the heart stamped an indelible mark on Emory that is still evident. He cultivated that philosophy at Yale, where he took 4 separate degrees, and honed it during his term as Dean of Emory's Candler School of Theology. It was during Dr. Laney's tenure that Candler was ranked among the top 10 theological colleges in North America. After stepping down as president of Emory University, Dr. Laney was appointed U.S. Ambassador to South Korea. It was a homecoming of sorts. As a United Methodist minister, Dr. Laney had once served there as a missionary. Dr. Gary Hawk of Emory University spoke with Dr. Laney in January 2005.
When you got to Candler then in 1969, you must have had clearly some goals, some intentions. What specifically did you have in mind in terms of shaping theological education through Candler, and how did you set about trying to reach those goals or move the faculty toward them?
Well, first of all, I was very deeply committed to contextual education. In a sense, a modern counterpart would be service learning. The sense in which you are put into a situation, it was vicariously at Harvard and other law schools and business schools with a case study. But in this instance, you really enter the situation itself with all of the emotional and other overtones, but under careful supervision, not only of the person who is an expert in it, in one case a clinical pastoral education, a hospital or institution similar to that, or an urban setting. I was very much interested in getting the pastoral students into more than just the hospitals. I wanted them to understand the urban problems, the race problem, the problem of poverty and health care and that sort of thing. And so we set up a series of practicums, you might say, in which all the students who were in the pastoral program, the ministerial program, had to take one full semester or its equivalent in the CPE where they learned to be in supervision, and then the next year in an urban setting, and then finally we did it in terms of the church itself, identifying churches that we thought modeled good ministry and care for the parishioners and the role in the community. But the unique thing about it, that was doing it that intensively was probably somewhat of a pioneering effort at that time, although now I think it's pretty commonplace. The thing that was really unique was insisting that the faculty themselves participate in this, move out of the classroom. This had some very interesting reverberations, and I was enormously helped in this by Charles Gherkin, whom I recruited from Grady Hospital. I was very impressed with him and brought him out as a member of the faculty teaching, but also who would oversee the whole program and meet once a month with the faculty who were participating. What this meant was if there were 12 supervisors who were professionals, there were 12 faculty paired with those, each of those, who each had 15 students or whatever. And the faculty were expected to reflect theologically in behalf of the students, but as it turned out, in behalf of themselves. And Gherkin was a master at helping shape the faculty and overcome their resistance, which we would all have. I mean, this is not a criticism, it's just natural. So that out of that, we not only got more closely allied with the students and their struggles, but also the faculty themselves were beginning to forge a community because they were sharing, all of them were sharing something in common. But I think that was the most important thing that we did because it had an impact on the student body. It also created a community with the faculty and a bond with the students. And I participated myself, so I know what it was like, and it meant a great deal to me. There were several other aspects to the opportunities that Candler provided. One was, at that time, the Ministerial Education Fund of the Methodist Church, which had actually begun out of the old 1% and 2% plan that Henry Bowden and Buster Bird and D.W. Brooks had started back in the 50s with Dean Trimble, had now gone nationwide, was beginning to move into high gear, and that was providing significant funding for the Methodist seminaries. And Candler was getting about almost $1 million a year, which was a lot of money at that time. So I persuaded President Atwood to let Candler be a tub on its own bottom. I just thought we could do it. And this was a relief to him because Candler had been subsidized by a substantial amount every year by the general university funds. So we were able not only to, that gave a lot of freedom in terms of how much new faculty we could add as long as we could pay for it. Mm-hmm. And we could carry over our balances at the end of the year, which had not been done before, where they never had a balance. So we could build up a reserve, in other words. So within the first 3 or 4 years, we added 12 net faculty to a faculty that was almost a 50% increase. And these were all bright young faculty. It was a huge change, and theological education is a small universe, and that caused a lot of waves around the country that Candler was doing all this, you know. And then the third thing was, that came a little later, was the opportunity to purchase the Hartford Seminary Library, which catapulted us from nowhere to number 2 in the country and among theological libraries. And really was a marvelous addition, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of quality and range and that sort of thing. So all of that was a sort of a yeasty mix that kept everything bubbling. I remember about the 4th year I was there, somebody said, there's a new ranking out among the theological schools, and Candler was ranked way, Candler had never been ranked anywhere, and he was ranked way up, I don't know, tied with Princeton or something, and, up in the top pantheon of the top half dozen or something. And all of a sudden, it was a bracing realization. I look back upon those 8 years as being as productive and as happy as any I've ever had.
The theology school really had risen in stature nationally in its ranking, let's say, and the Graduate Division of Religion began its climb upward. In many ways, the pockets of religious study throughout the university were academically at the fore. And yet, 1976, Sanford Atwood announces that the following year he's going to retire as president. And you come to the fore as the candidate for the presidency. I imagine that there were some skeptics around the university.
Oh, no skeptics.
About the prospect of having this research university led by a Methodist minister, the dean of the theology school. What was? Let me ask you first of all, what it was that led you to consider moving from the deanship of the theology school to leadership of the university, and then how did you address the skeptics out there?
Well, I don't know how I address the skeptics except by action, but part of it was the growing confidence that what we were doing was an appropriate sort of setting the pace for the university. I mean, obviously disciplines vary and schools have the curriculum and all that, but the ideas of what made for outstanding educational experience, I think, were valid in themselves. I had brought Lee Keck here from Vanderbilt in '72, I think, to head up the graduate division. He went on 7 years later to become dean at Yale. And then in 1974, Krista Stendahl, who was dean at Harvard, invited me to come up as a visiting professor. I had a leave coming, which had already been approved by the president and so forth. So we went up there, and it turned out very quickly that what they were doing was looking me over for the possibility of his successor. And I taught a seminar there, and realized that I was interviewed by trustees, and of course got to know Derek Bach, and I realized, that what we were doing at Emory was of that measure. I mean, we didn't have anything to apologize for. I mean, Emory was very good, and there was a kind of a new confidence built on the fact, and I had already served while I was dean on the visiting committee to oversee the Yale Religious Life and Divinity School. I served on the committee. I wasn't chair of it, and was confident that what we were doing was it was good. It didn't owe apology to anybody, and it didn't take second place to either Harvard or Yale. Well, with that kind of confidence, and the fact that because Henry Bowden and some of the other trustees knew that Harvard was looking at me, they already, when I came back in '75, began saying, well, we'd like for you to consider the possibility of being president. Now, there was a lot to go through and all, and the integrity of the process, but they wanted me not to leave, in other words. And I was comfortable with that because I felt that if it should work out that way, and I knew a number of the trustees, that we would have a team. We'd have at least a handful of the trustees backing it, and I had the confidence then that what we were doing could be drawn on a larger canvas. I don't mean everything, but the general ideas, the direction of the university. And so I think out of that, and the kind of entrepreneurship that was involved with the Hartford Seminary purchase, which, by the way, got a whole page in the New York Times on the second section or something back then, which they said was the largest transfer of books in American history, which we loved all that, and so out of that grew the thought that if the bid should come to me, I certainly would not be averse to taking it. It wasn't something that I had consciously sought. That I can say that, but as it kind of evolved, as the likelihood of it increased, or the prospects, my confidence that it would not be inappropriate seemed to correspondingly increase. Mm-hmm. I think that's the only way I'd say it. I didn't feel at all intimidated by the thought of working in the whole university as opposed to just a theology school.
You mentioned the Hartford book collection purchase, which certainly was a bold move, and I think of the beginning of your presidency really as a series of bold steps. It may not have felt like that at the time, but just shortly after you became president, you and the board agreed to launch a major fundraising drive. I think when you became president, you announced that some of your ambitions included raising the level of scholarship funding, endowed professorships,
Right,
and
right.
so on. And clearly you also had a vision for enhancing campus life and student life. But it was really in 1979 the announcement of the $105 million Woodruff Fund transfer to Emory that came as a blockbuster piece of news and was really a bold step for the university. Garnered national attention as the largest gift to higher education in American history up to that point. Say a little bit about what led to that gift and how that was nurtured and what some of the thinking was behind it, both in terms of the university administration and the trustees of the fund.
Well, I think to answer that, I'd want to say, first of all, that within 3 months of my assuming office as president, I did lay before the trustees a whole list of things that I wanted to try to accomplish. And I look back on it, and I want to be careful. This is not said in a patronizing way, but I really saw myself as an educator in every sense of that word. My role was to articulate and educate the trustees. That is, to help them understand what we were about, and if the goals were worthy, to get their support. Educate the faculty as to what we were trying to accomplish together, in addition to their own work and all, and of course to educate the students. And how did we do that most successfully? And so it was always on my mind to try to articulate, to try to set forth constantly what we're about and why it's important and how we might get there. And of course, to get there, it means enlisting support. So in that sense, it was an act of persuasion. Nothing but rhetoric. I learned this way back. The rhetoric of touching the common chords of response that people shared, and then building on that, So in a way, you develop confidence and trust, and you move forward. I think the trustees were they sort of caught their breath when I laid out what I thought we needed to do and began to put a price tag on it, because it was really very aggressive for Emory at that time. And, there's a question of, well, do you really need this? I mean, are these ambitions, are these real, or are these just personal sort of things, And, you have to, they have to buy into the vision that this is not only what should be done, but it can be done. And that if in doing it, we really will accomplish something that's worthwhile. We're not just going to keep along with the status quo and that sort of thing. So, set that forth. Now, the interesting thing is that Mr. Woodruff wasn't on the board, so I had to go over and see him a lot to keep him up to date with what was going on back here. And in those meetings, I wanted to share with him what we were about. And we had some interesting talks, and particularly the time when he said he didn't believe in endowment. We were trying to raise a lot of money for endowment. Well, it turns out that was based on his thought that endowment was idle capital. And it took me about 2 or 3 weeks to figure out idle capital. Well, the opposite of idle capital is working capital. That is a term that they use in business as working capital. So we simply transliterated endowment into working capital, and he bought it, so that was fine. But once he signed on, it wasn't a question of what he was doing, but he had to begin to get a sense of the enthusiasm and himself participate in this, in the positive spirit that it was. And so that was took a while. And of course, it was 2 years and something after I became president before we got the gift. And I remember one of the things that Jimmy Sibley and I talked about very early on, and Jimmy Williams, was maybe we can get the trustees of the fund to raise the payout to Emory from 40 to 60%, which would be a big, lot. If the fund was worth over $100 million, that'd be equivalent of $20 million, the income from $20 million. But in the process, the thought of that and the thought that of George Woodruff, that he and Robert were going to die, in the not too distant future, led them, particularly George, to say, why don't we just turn the whole thing over to Emory? I mean, the corpus. Well, the difference between receiving a portion of the income and getting the whole corpus is enormous, because, of course, the growth of the corpus over the next, 15 years was just unbelievable. I mean, those 3 million shares of Coke that were transferred to us, the market value today would be way over $2 billion. I mean, if you want to say, what would a gift comparable to that make a splash today? Well, $2 billion would do it. But that was big money. Yeah. And anyway, George took appropriate pride in, George Woodruff, in sort of helping it. Mr. Woodruff, of course, had to be enthusiastic about it, although it wouldn't have happened without his say-so, because he was the dominant brother. The gift came without restriction. That is, on its use and how, although they said we'd like for it to be endowment, they didn't even, I don't think there was any restriction on that. It was, and it was for the university. And that was a godsend, because then, without, we could begin to make plans for the whole university. Not slighting medicine, but putting it in perspective, in the total picture. The other thing that happened about that time was the growing conviction that we ought to try to sequester the Woodruff Fund from the general endowment. The idea of sequestering the thing was that we wanted to see if we couldn't continue the power of initiative within the university. Once it gets built into the budget, an income stream, its power is there, but it has no an additional impetus into the budget or into the programs. And we succeeded in persuading the trustees. It wasn't hard to persuade them, because they always like to be conservative. But it was a hard row for the faculty. And some of the faculty were extraordinarily critical of the first few years of our use of the fund, because they didn't see the immediate results. In fact, some wrote in the Wheel that they thought that I somehow had some sort of chicanery involved, which is incredible. But in any case, the first working out of this, since we had set up scholarships and Woodruff professorships and special project like that as being the first call on it, was a need for a huge infusion in the Emory College and scholarships. It's hard to believe what the scholarship budget was when I took over. I think it was less than $1 million for the whole college. We were just so heavily tuition dependent, and that constrains us enormously. And David Minter, who was then the dean, came in and he said, "We need $20 million." $20 million, oh no. I don't remember what we finally wound up with, but it was a substantial amount. But we agreed that we would start off the first year with that amount, and the next year we would, it would grow, and then we'd back out. It'd grow year by year. We, would come in with the freshmen and so forth. But then after 4 years, we began to back it out, and we did. And the college had gradually built it into their budget. Well, the point of all this was to try to leave at least 50% of the Woodruff Fund free and unencumbered so that we could do matching things and pull back and so forth. And I think that worked for a long time. I think probably by now it's long since been fed into the budget, but that enabled for at least 15 years to start initiatives that were just invaluable. I mean, we could just simply do things. Extraordinarily fortunate in being able to become friends with Mr. Woodruff. We spent a lot of time together, and the more time I spent with him, the higher my opinion of him as a human being was. He had the most ineffable smile I've ever seen on a man. He didn't always smile, but when he did, it was absolutely winsome. And I could see why, as a younger man, he was so successful in whatever he did, because he just had this marvelous, in a sense, charisma in that sense. Not rhetorically, but personality-wise. And I remember once on his birthday was in December the 6th, I think, and the first year I was president, I was racking my brain to think, what can I give Mr. Woodruff for a birthday present? And Alistair Cook had come to the campus in October to deliver the Robert Jones lecture, the Bobby Jones lecture. And the next week, when he gave his weekly Voice from America, he spent the whole time talking about Emory. And he raved about Emory, and he said it was the most beautiful campus he had been on in America. And he said, far better than Berkeley or Princeton or whatever. And so through some friends, I got hold of that tape and took it down to Itchaway, where Mr. Woodruff always celebrated his birthday, down at his plantation. It was absolutely unheard of to say that you wanted to come on Mr. Woodruff's birthday and invite yourself. But I did. And they said, you can come at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No stay for dinner. Okay. So I took a tape recorder and played it for him, the Alistair Cook thing, where he was so high on it. And I left. And from then on, I got an invitation on my own to come for the birthday every year down there to Itchaway. And we had a good time. Hunting was included in that, but we shared a lot. And I looked upon him in a way as a kind of a father figure. He was a lovely human being, and he was always interested in what we were doing at Emory. He wanted me to tell him all we were doing. I don't mean the minutiae, but the big things. And he was so proud of it. And after, this is an important, good story. After the Woodruff gift had been announced, it was on the front page of the New York Times and all. He said, Doctor, he never called me Jim. Dr. Laney, do you know how much money Buck Duke gave to Trinity College? And I said, I've heard it was $40 million, Mr. Woodruff. He said, and how did they show their appreciation? I said, you know, they changed the name of Trinity College to Duke University. He took his cigar out of his mouth. And I said, I think that was appropriate, don't you, Mr. Woodruff? Yeah, I do. And I said, and you know what? Your gift is the largest, it even beat that gift. He smiled, and he said, yeah. And that was the end of the conversation. I was so afraid he was going to ask me directly, but he never did. And he never seemed to bother him at all that we didn't change the name of the university.
Let me turn to something that really was a kind of coup, one among many in your presidency. After President Carter's defeat for re-election in 1980, he was offered, I think, a number of possibilities to affiliate with various universities. But he ended up joining the faculty at Emory and beginning a collaboration with the university that has been rich and varied over the last 2.5 decades. How did you recruit a former president of the United States to the Emory faculty? What went into that?
Just went up and asked him to come. No, it really began with Hamilton Jordan approaching me. Our son Tom was working as a theological student intern in Washington at the White House. He got that on his own, not through me, because I didn't really know President Carter that well. And Tom, our son Tom, knew Hamilton, and Hamilton wanted to see me, and he said, I'm leaving the administration regardless of the election, and I'd like to come and spend a semester or a year at Emory as a visiting scholar or something like that. I want to write a book. So we worked that out. But in the process, we had some talks about what if President Carter didn't win. And so when that sad eventuality occurred, I was prepared to talk with President Carter and had an access to him through Hamilton Jordan. We got along well. We share a lot of the same things. We have Southern roots. We're both religious. You know, we both tend to be moral, if not moralistic. And you know, the things that he talked about wanting to do are the things that I thought would be good for him to be allied with, and certainly for him to be on the faculty and all. So one thing led to another, and partly our friendship developed into a partnership. But I really didn't, although we had been to the White House several times, we were with a large group, and it did not indicate anything while he was president. I was not close to him, but we developed the friendship later. And I think the quality of the Carter Center's work and its success is a testimony to the validity of his establishing the center and of our association with him.
I want to come back to something you said earlier about the power of persuasion and the art of rhetoric and the importance of rhetoric and language to the presidency of the university or to any leadership position. One of the phrases that people appropriately associate with your presidency is the phrase, the education of the heart. This was the title of an address you gave at Harvard, and it was later the title of a collection of your speeches and essays. And I'm curious about how you arrived at that phrase, how you came to that, not just that phrase, but to that concept as a kind of guiding emphasis of your leadership.
Well, really, this was a formulation that kind of grew out of this idea of education as formation. My own education at Yale, particularly in the divinity school, and my 2-year stint as chaplain and as English teacher at Choate School, a boarding school in Connecticut, convinced me of the age-old business, going back to Plato, and of the importance of formation. Education is not merely theoretical. It's a total person, and that values are inherent in what's going on and what's important, how we choose this and that, and what attracts us and what repels us. All of that's part of it, and it's simply a matter of explicating that and trying to, the desiccation of higher education because of the excessive specialization and the pressures on the faculty to be accountable to their disciplines nationally and their professional organizations rather than either to their own institution or their students. That tension that they live with. Now, this is not a criticism of the faculty. That is life as we see it today. Nevertheless, tended, unless there was a countervailing force, then it would pull the faculty away, and they felt that their assessment in their work was primarily by their peers. And that's a very important part of the quality. But also an important thing is the dynamics of the classroom and the interaction of faculty and students. And over and over again, I'm impressed when some of the finest faculty and the most distinguished scholars speak of how some of their best insights come from seminars with undergraduates, because there's a free-flowing kind of interaction in that scholarship and so forth. Not just the pursuit of a laser-like thing, but that freshness and impromptu quality. And it was that aspect in formation and how people really, while we might back away from in loco parentis, the fact is that faculty have a huge influence on how what students think and how they feel, their view of life. I mean, they really want to they want to find a student. They don't want to be told, and they certainly don't want it imposed and make it a requirement, but they are constantly taking their cue from faculty and from mentors. That's the whole point of what a mentor means. It's not just what you learn from them consciously, but all that, and the issue of in law and in medicine and other thing of apprenticeship and internship and all that sort of thing carries with it that kind of weight. And so it has to do with judgment as well as knowledge that comes out of this kind of education. And I don't know where the phrase came from, Gary, but I think it was an evolution, a series of speeches that I had developed talking to teachers, actually. And then Harvard asked me to speak to the National Association of Alumni Heads. And so I gave that speech, and the editor of the Harvard magazine was there, and he said, "That is so radical." Radical? Well, yeah, Plato's radical, and and Rousseau is radical. All of the great philosophers of education. I think back of my own education, and this is where I got it. It's hardly novel.
But it in many ways it guided, I would imagine, your thinking about campus life programs.
It was.
Certainly the contextual education that you spoke about. In
all of that.
School.
And my desire to get a better campus life experience for students was part and part. This wasn't just indulging the students. It was really an attempt to make more conscious and to give a more positive spin to how they experienced, and the extracurricular activity, all the things that go on campus that are part of the education, you know. And it was that. And anyway, the Harvard Magazine published published this speech, and was supposed to shock and awe the Harvard audience. The Harvard faculty, I think, read it and yawned.
I thought I would ask you for some impressions of or memories of some of the Emory leaders and benefactors and great lights that you encountered during your time as president. Henry Bowden Sr., chairman of the Board of Trustees when you became president.
Henry was sui generis. He was uniquely Emory, beloved by Emory, and unqualified love for Emory. He and his generation of Emory graduates back in the 30s ran the university for a long time. He and Pollard Turman and Beauflay Jones and, of course, Jake Ward and a whole bunch of others were involved in that. Henry was really the one who recruited me for president. I wouldn't be president. I wouldn't have been president if he hadn't been for Henry. He believed in me, I think, and despite the fact that I was a Methodist minister and a theologian. But in any case, Henry just knew everybody and everything, and of course he was a great raconteur, and that meant that he could always give a speech at the drop of a hat, and he was like the Pied Piper, and I learned so much from Henry. How to deal with people in a gracious way and not simply a hectoring way. As is a tendency of ministers, But anyway, Henry was such a remarkable person. There are a lot of people like Henry who really have loved Emory in the long way. And in a way, I realized that I was an outsider who came in, and I had to learn to see Emory from their standpoint, and not just the Emory that I thought it ought to become. And the combination of those two is a powerful thing.
Let me ask you about a faculty member that's legendary, now passed from the scene, George Cutino.
George, I call him my beloved curmudgeon. George and I got acquainted when Bert and I and our children were at Oxford when I was dean of the theology school in Oxford, England. He was over there on leave, and we were there for a term. And we just got acquainted. We saw each other a lot and became real good friends. I think up until that time, the last thing he would have ever wanted was the thought of a Methodist minister being president of Emory. But I think after that, we became friends, and it was not, if it was not something he endorsed, it was something that at least he could live with. But of course, he was the, what do you call it, not the beadle, but
the chief marshal.
Chief marshal, right. And he took great pride in that. And he helped me design my president's robe, and we had a great time. We would often disagree, and it was a wonderful disagreement because we could really snarl at each other and never mean it.
One of the first Woodruff professors you recruited was Richard Ellman.
Mm-hmm. Dick Ellman was a lovely human being and a marvelous scholar. At that time was the Goldsmiths Professor of English Literature at Oxford, and we were able to get him to spend half of a year here every year as Woodruff Professor. Ellman and his wife Mary were a marvelous addition, and I think they raised the visibility of Emory across the Atlantic. by choosing to come here. And he was such a gracious soul that instead of being seen as an outsider and a sort of, you know, snob or something coming in from fancy places, he quickly became a real colleague of not just of English, but of in arts and sciences. And I think did more to allay the anxieties or uneasiness or standoffishness of the faculty about these new appointments, because he was so fine. Of course, he and I became really good friends, and we visited him in Oxford and all. I might add, as a footnote, they used to live at Clifton Towers when they were at Emory, which is not far from Lowwater. And at that time, our paper was delivered on Clifton Road at the mailbox, which is a half a mile from the house. And I'd look out in the morning, and here would be Dick Ellman, and what I called his fast trudge. This was jogging, but it was hardly jogging. And he would drop the paper at our doorstep and keep going around the circle. And I thought, whoever had a more sublime paper boy.
That's a great story. Pollard Terman, for whom the Terman Residential Center is named.
Right. Pollard was one of those, along with Henry Bowden. He was willing to do anything for Emory. And when we were without a development officer very early in my presidency, he became the acting vice president for development, which meant his office at that time was down the hall. And he became a very dear and trusted advisor for me. Invaluable. Pollard was one of the people who could interpret what we were trying to do to the trustees in a gracious way. Pollard ranks up there with the top Emory graduates, just a superb human being. I spoke at his funeral, and I remember I thought, Pollard is everyone's best friend. Everybody who knows him thinks that Pollard is his best friend. He was, Berta always said, he is the best gentleman I've ever met.
You must, it seems to me, think from time to time about your legacy and what you were able to do with your colleagues at Emory. And how does one, just to take it out of the personal realm, how does one reflect on that legacy a decade after the fact, and how does one hope for the future and what comes after? How do you reflect on what you were able to do and what you hope still can be done as a result of that?
Well, first of all, I don't have any concerns institutionally about Emory. Emory is flourishing far beyond anything I could have imagined when I was here. My confidence in what we were trying to do in terms of the spirit of Emory and the educational philosophy is so fundamental. That is, my confidence that it's so necessary and right and timely. And I'm pleased that Emory is carrying that on. I don't want to call it a legacy. My interest is in how the spirit of education really informs this nation. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess my time and career in government has given me a sense of the nation. I don't want to sound grandiose at all, but I really, those are my greatest concerns. Who are we as a people, and what are we doing, and how does education fit into that? Mm-hmm. And just to be the mostest and the bestest is really, it's shallow. It's very shallow, and I think education has as its primary purpose the deepening of these things. You know, the fundamental questions about life and what we're about and why we're doing things. And to raise these not in the sense of trying to depreciate all the various activities of humankind, but rather to make sure that there's certain focal points. That's what I'm concerned about, and that's what I continue to speak about and work for. And I'm proud of Emory's role in that.